There is a piece of water 2.8 kilometers wide at its narrowest point that carries more oil every single day than the Strait of Hormuz. More than the Suez Canal. More than any other shipping lane on Earth. You've probably never heard of it by name, but it has a nickname inside the Chinese Communist Party that translates to the dilemma. Not a metaphor, an actual internal code word for the single greatest vulnerability in the second largest economy on the planet. It sits between Indonesia and Malaysia. It's so shallow in places that the biggest oil tankers on the ocean can't even fully load before passing through it. And in 2025 alone, more than 102,500 ships sailed through it, one roughly every 6 minutes, day and night, all year. This is the Strait of Malacca. And unlike Hormuz, nobody threatens to close it. Nobody has to. Its danger isn't a switch someone might flip. It's a single point of failure that every major economy in Asia has quietly built its entire supply chain on top of, and can't undo. Let's start with the geography, because the numbers here are almost uncomfortable once you see them side by side. The Strait of Malacca runs for roughly 800 kilometers between the Indonesian island of Sumatra and the Malay Peninsula, connecting the Indian Ocean to the South China Sea. At its narrowest point, the Phillips Channel near Singapore, it pinches down to about 2.8 kilometers wide. For comparison, that's narrower than Hormuz's shipping lanes. And in some stretches, the strait is only around 23 meters deep, which means the largest crude carriers on Earth, the ones that could technically carry 2 million barrels in a single hull, physically cannot transit it fully loaded. They have to top off elsewhere. A modern global economy, built on ships the size of skyscrapers laid sideways, is bottlenecked by a channel that in places is barely deeper than a swimming pool is long. And through that channel moves an amount of oil that should genuinely stop you. In the first half of 2025, an average of 23.2 million barrels of crude and petroleum products passed through the Strait of Malacca every single day, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration. That's not a typo relative to Hormuz. Malacca actually carries more, since almost every barrel that transits Hormuz bound for Asia has to pass through Malacca afterward too. Roughly 29% of all the world's seaborne oil trade funnels through this one channel. Layer on natural gas, nearly 9.2 billion cubic feet of LNG a day and general cargo, and you're looking at something like 25 to 30% of all global seaborne trade, worth in the neighborhood of $3.5 trillion a year. That's roughly a third of global GDP, moving past a shoreline you could drive along in an afternoon. Now here's where this story stops being about the world in the abstract and becomes about one country in particular. In November 2003, Chinese President Hu Jintao stood in front of senior Communist Party officials and used a phrase that has shaped Chinese energy and military strategy for more than 2 decades since: the Malacca Dilemma. His point was blunt. Somewhere between 70% and 80% of China's oil imports, and roughly 2/3 of its total trade, pass through this single strait. A passage China does not control, cannot fully patrol, and has no realistic way of replacing. Who warned that certain major powers, understood by everyone in the room to mean the United States, could, in the event of a serious conflict, simply choke that lane and bring China's industrial economy to its knees without firing a shot on Chinese soil. China's own domestic oil consumption has climbed from around 3.5 million barrels a day in 2000 to more than 15 million barrels a day now. Roughly 16 million of the barrels moving through Malacca each day are headed toward Northeast Asia, and China alone is estimated to account for close to half of that. This isn't a talking point. It's a documented, decades-long strategic anxiety at the highest level of the Chinese state, and it has driven billions of dollars in pipelines, ports, and naval investment specifically engineered to reduce dependence on one channel of water. So how has Beijing actually tried to solve it? 3 ways, and all 3 have run into the same wall. First, pipelines. China built a pipeline network running oil and gas from Myanmar's Bay of Bengal ports overland into Yunnan province, fully operational since 2014, specifically so that some crude could skip the strait entirely. It also runs pipelines from Central Asia and Russia. Combined, these overland routes carry somewhere around 3.7 million barrels a day, with plans to expand toward 9 million. That sounds significant until you remember China is consuming more than 15 million barrels a day and importing about 80% of it. Even at full planned capacity, the pipelines cover maybe half the gap, and only the northern and western half of China's demand, nowhere near its industrial coastal cities in the south and east, which still need seaborne oil. Second, ports. China has spent years building and financing port infrastructure across the Indian Ocean, Gwadar in Pakistan, Hambantota in Sri Lanka, and others. A network sometimes called the String of Pearls, meant to diversify access points. It has not meaningfully reduced the volume moving through Malacca. Third, and most fantastical, an actual canal. The idea of cutting a channel across the Kra Isthmus in southern Thailand, bypassing Malacca entirely by connecting the Andaman Sea directly to the Gulf of Thailand, was first proposed in 1677. It has been revisited at least a dozen times since, including as recently as the early 2000s, and shelved every single time over cost, engineering difficulty, and the political reality that Thailand would suddenly become the most strategically important country in Asia, a position neither its neighbors nor global powers are eager to hand it. So more than 20 years after Hu Jintao named the problem, China's own analysts estimate that if it were ever forced to fully reroute around Malacca via the Lombok or Sunda Straits in the Indonesian archipelago instead, the added distance and time could cost the Chinese economy on the order of $220 billion a year. The dilemma, in other words, was never solved. It was just managed. Now let's talk about who actually keeps this lane physically functioning, because unlike Hormuz, there's no single dominant navy running the show. The Strait of Malacca is bordered by 3 countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, with Thailand as a 4th stakeholder further north, and none of them individually owns it. Under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, foreign vessels get the right of innocent passage through it, similar to Hormuz. But instead of one navy enforcing that, you've got a joint arrangement called the Malacca Straits Patrol, coordinated air and sea patrols run collectively by Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand since 2004. All 4 governments have publicly and repeatedly ruled out the idea of ever charging a toll or restricting passage. They know their own economies, especially Singapore's, are built entirely around this strait staying open and free. Singapore in particular has almost nothing to sell the world except its location. A transit hub economy that only exists because ships have to funnel past it. So if there's no toll, what's the actual cost mechanism here? This is where the story diverges from Hormuz in a genuinely interesting way, because Malacca's core threat isn't a hostile government. It's crime. In the 2000s, piracy in the strait got so bad that in 2005, Lloyd's of London, the world's most influential marine insurance market, formally declared it a high war risk zone, in the same official category as active conflict areas. That single designation added roughly 1% of a vessel's entire cargo value as an extra insurance premium on every transit. Regional patrols brought the numbers down enough that the designation was lifted the following year, and piracy fell for most of the 2010s. But it never disappeared, and in 2025, it came roaring back in a way that caught the shipping industry off guard. According to the regional monitoring body ReCAAP, incidents in the Malacca and Singapore Straits jumped from 62 in 2024 to 108 in 2025, a 74% increase, and the highest number recorded in almost 2 decades of tracking. The International Maritime Bureau's global count for the same waters put the figure even higher, at over 100 incidents, accounting for more than half of all piracy and armed robbery reported anywhere on Earth that year. Some of those incidents were low-level opportunistic theft, crews boarded at night for spare parts and cash. But the IMB also recorded incidents involving guns and knives, crew taken hostage, and large vessels over 100,000 deadweight tons successfully boarded. It took a coordinated crackdown by Indonesian authorities in mid-2025, arresting organized gangs operating out of the Riau Islands, to bring the numbers back down in the second half of the year. That's the uncomfortable truth about this choke point. Its main threat isn't a government threatening closure. It's small boats and organized crime, quietly taxing global trade one boarded vessel at a time, largely under the radar of anyone who doesn't work in shipping insurance. Let's put a real number on what instability here actually costs, because this is where it connects straight back to your wallet even though almost nobody frames it that way. Every serious spike in risk in these waters, whether it's a piracy wave or geopolitical tension spilling over from elsewhere, pushes up war risk insurance premiums for every ship transiting the strait, the same mechanism that hits Hormuz. Multiply that across the roughly 102,500 vessels that made the crossing in 2025, And you're talking about a shipping industry quietly absorbing tens of millions of dollars in extra costs during any sustained spike, costs that eventually work their way into freight rates, and from there into the price of everything moving from Asian factories to the rest of the world. And 2026 has added a new wrinkle that analysts are now openly discussing. With tension around the Strait of Hormuz itself escalating this year, China's exposure has effectively compounded. Roughly half of China's imported oil and about a third of its imported LNG originates in the Persian Gulf, meaning it has to clear Hormuz first and then Malacca second on the same journey. Commentators have started calling this the layering of a Hormuz dilemma on top of the original Malacca Dilemma. Two choke points, back-to-back, on the same supply line, each individually capable of disrupting the same barrels. Here's the part one actually want to hear your take on, because I think reasonable people land in genuinely different places. China has spent more than 2 decades and enormous sums of money trying to engineer its way out of a vulnerability that, by its own government's admission, threatens its energy security and therefore its economic stability. And after all of that spending, it still can't meaningfully reduce its dependence on a strait it doesn't control. Some people look at that and see the natural, fair outcome of geography. China industrialized late, the map is the map, and no country is owed a guaranteed safe route to someone else's oil. Other people look at the same situation and see something closer to a structural chokehold, a small number of countries, and by extension whichever navy shows up to patrol alongside them, holding effective leverage over the industrial base of the world's second-largest economy simply by controlling a strip of water it happens to sit beside. So which is it to you? Is this just the ordinary cost of geography that every trading nation has to accept? Or is a strait this important to one country's economy something the international system should be actively rebalancing? Drop your take in the comments. I've seen genuinely smart people argue both sides of this one. Let's close with the actual bill because just like with Hormuz, nobody sends a single unified invoice for keeping this lane open. Several different parties are each quietly paying their own separate share. Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand fund the joint patrols that keep piracy from spiraling back to mid-2000s levels. China is funding pipelines, ports, and a rapidly expanding navy specifically to hedge against a strait it can't secure on its own. Shipping companies are absorbing fluctuating war risk premiums every time incidents spike, the same way they do in the Gulf. And ordinary consumers in Shenzhen, in Seoul, in Tokyo, and eventually everywhere goods from Asia end up, are paying the final, invisible bill in the price of manufactured goods, electronics, and energy every time this waterway gets a little riskier to cross. There's no CEO of the Strait of Malacca, no single government that can raise or lower the toll. Just 3 coastal nations, a rotating cast of pirates and patrol boats, and the largest manufacturing economy on Earth quietly betting, year after year, that a 2.8-kilometer gap in the water stays open long enough for the next tanker to get through. It has, for decades. The moment that changes, you won't read about it in a shipping newsletter first. You'll see it in the price tag of the next phone, car, or container of goods that was supposed to come through on time.